Good morning and welcome to today's VOC Foundation talk. Today's lecture is on education at the Cape under the VOC 1652 to 1795 and the role of the Dutch Reformed Church in the development of education. And today's speaker is Sigi Howes. From the time that the VOC was active at the Cape, education was a purely elementary character and in the hands of the church. It was not compulsory and made provision only for religious instruction, some rudimentary arithmetic, reading and writing, and its purpose was mainly to prepare young people for church membership. And yet, there were pockets of excellence that allowed the British to build on after 1806, and it was directly due to the zeal and the efforts of the Dutch Reformed Church that the people in the outlying districts did not grow up altogether destitute of education. Sigi is the recently retired principal of the Western Cape Education Department's Centre for Conservation Education and Education Museum in Wynberg. One of the functions of museums is to do research, and this has driven Sigi for the last 20 years to research the history of schools in the Western Cape, as well as the former Cape Province, and before that, the Cape Colony. Early education at the Cape is her specialist field, and even though retired, Sigi still gets many requests for information on early education. She holds a BA degree in history, a Primary Teachers Diploma, Higher Education Diploma, a Post-Graduate Diploma in Museology, and a Master's degree in Education Policy Studies. Thank you, Jean.
Thanks, Jean. So Jean didn't say it, but her dad was my boss, Dan Slay, and working under such a gentle but knowledgeable leader was very inspiring. And I was very lucky to take over from him and take over the principalship of the Centre for Conservation Education, which incorporates the Education Museum and still does. Those were the happiest days of my life. It was a dream job and I loved every single minute of it. Being retired has its advantages, but also has disadvantages in that you do feel a bit, jy's uitgeskakel van die realiteit. And I miss the status that my job gave me. But nevertheless, I still work because I do a variety of research. And thank you, Jean, for those words. I've chucked in a little bit of a light-hearted content because I don't think people want to come out on a Saturday morning om net droë goed te hoor oor die onderwys. So we must have a few things to laugh at because, well, that's what learning is all about. And I've also taken the date a little bit further than 1795 because it's very hard just to stop at one date. So I've just taken a wee bit further just so that you can get a better picture because Alex asked for a combination of two topics. And that was quite hard to do. Because if you take two topics, either your talk is going to be extra long, double the length, or you're going to only give half the information. So I tried to do what he asked, but yes, it may be a little bit difficult, and you are welcome to ask questions. You can ask questions in between if you like. As long as you don't ask too many questions and we can't get a move on, then we'll do the questions at the end. But I'm happy to take questions. So I want to just start by 1652. There has been a lot of discourse in the last few years about the empty land syndrome, which I'm sure you are all aware of, that when the Dutch arrived in 1652, the land was not empty and that there was nobody who was using it. The land was very much used, and that's part of the modern discourse. And I'm just reading quite a well-known book at the moment called The Lie of 1652, which challenges that particular notion. And I was just saying to Jean earlier, you know, we knew that at school. We weren't taught that all life in South Africa began in 1652. But there is a perception out there that we as white people were only taught a certain history, and we know nothing about the rest, and I would like to dispute that. But nevertheless, I think it is good to look a little bit broader and a little bit wider, because the land certainly was being used, and there were Khoi tribes here and San before that, and although there were no formal structures of education, these people did educate their children. They taught them the life skills that they needed, particularly things like hunting and gathering and growing crops and making arrows, and whatever they needed to live, they were being taught. So there was informal education at the Cape already when the Dutch arrived here. I want to just do a quick summary on the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. Most of you who belong to this society and have been with it for many years know all this. So I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to the ones who don't know. People like me who perhaps didn't know the history before. There might be some of you who don't know how this company came about. So we know it started in 1602 and it was chartered as a trading company. It was given the monopoly by the Dutch States General of the Netherlands to carry out trading activities in Asia, headquarters in Batavia. That's why that comes up so often. And just look at what they had the powers to do. And this is what's interesting, and this is what made them so powerful, and how they could take control of the Cape. They had the ability to wage war, imprison and execute convicts, negotiate treaties, strike its own coins, establish colonies. So they could act de facto almost like a government, even though they were just a trading company. They were the world's first multinational company, very rich. By 1669, they were the richest private company in the world. And in 1652, they came to the Cape to set up a halfway station here. So their aim was trade. They had no thoughts of education. That was not in their agenda at all. Education is never on the agenda where there's business and trade as the important thing. And they relied very heavily on slavery for their man and woman power. So that's got to be seen in that context. So they came here to do business. But then everything changed in 1658 when 2 ships arrived full of slaves. And the interesting thing is, the first one was the Amersfoort. They were children. In other words, the slaves were all under the age of 18. Now, whether in those days they were considered adults or not isn't really the issue. The point is they were put to work because children of that age often are very strong, healthy usually, but they were children. And of course they could not speak Dutch, they could not understand Dutch, and they were also not Christians. So the children from the Amersfoort, and you can see there are 174 out of the 250 that were originally put on the ship survived. The others all died en route. They were mostly from Angola. And then the Hasselt, 2 months later, which brought 81 children from the coast of Guinea, from Dahomey, the country, or that area mainly, the kingdom of Dahomey, which we call Benin today, and just look how few of them survived. 81 arrived here out of 222, although I think 80 of those were sent on to Batavia because these children were actually quite healthy. The children on the Hasselt, they were big children, or they're big people from West Africa, and generally strong and very healthy. So these children were too. But calling them children changes our whole perspective of what was happening here and how the Cape started moving from a business office, so to speak, to a colony where there are now immigrants, if you like, although they were slaves, from other countries in Africa. And they're not just here to work. So at the fort, then the Council of Policy, which governed the activities of the company at the Cape, had a conundrum to settle. Now, what do we do with these kids? Yes, we want to use them for work, but how are we going to give them instructions? They cannot understand Dutch. So the obvious thing is you've got to teach them Dutch. And so that is why shortly after the second ship arrived, they established a school, and that was the first school in South Africa, 17th of April, 1658. At the Center for Conservation Education where I was, we always celebrated that day, as that's the day that education started on our soil. Formal education, let me correct myself. So it's important to remember, only slave children, no white children, no children of VOC employees, only the black children who were slaves. Right, so what was taught there? Well, basic reading and writing, as Jean already mentioned. It was in Dutch, because nobody could speak their language from West Africa. There were already little reading books that were being published in Holland. They were taught prayers and hymns, quotations from the Bible, and they had to learn recitations or learn to say out off by heart extracts from the Heidelberg Catechism, which was already even then quite important, and that's been something that the Dutch Reformed Church has always had. So those were the things that were taught. Now you can imagine that if these things were being taught in Dutch to children who'd never heard that language before, maybe the first time they've heard it is on the ship, have no idea what this is all about. Been taken from their homes, they've been traumatized, they've lost their families, they don't know really what is happening to them. But people at the Cape were deeply religious. That is a general feature of the European history, and also from the Netherlands, where the Dutch East India came from or originated. And so the Dutch church kind of developed at the same time as the refreshment station did at the Cape. Because if you were not a member of the church, you could not marry, you could not get married, you could not beget. In other words, you could not be baptized or have your children baptized. You could not die. In other words, you couldn't be buried. And so if you wanted all those things, you had to become a church member. And that, to become a church member, you had to be able to read the scriptures by yourself, which was completely different from the Roman Catholic idea, where you shouldn't read because the minister's going to interpret it all for you, and he can tell you what he wants. But the Dutch Reformed Church always had the belief that the people had to read the Bible themselves. You had to be able to sign your own name. You had to recite all the articles in faith that were in the Heidelberg Catechism. And the church therefore considered education as part of its duty. And so immediately you've got this working together of the church that is deciding, well, we've got to educate these children from West Africa, and we've got to make fine Christians out of them. And you've got the company that's saying, we need their labor, and we're going to have to put money into it. So the school was started by the company, all right? But it was in the hands of the church. So the person who was appointed to teach was what they called the ziekentrooster, or the sick comforter, who the first one there was Pieter van der Staal. He also happens to have been Jan van Riebeck's brother-in-law. He was married to Jan's sister, and he was well educated. He could read and write, and he was, to all accounts, quite a good teacher. So he was appointed to be the teacher, and he was paid by the VOC to teach under the church. He was a kind of a lay preacher, so he wasn't an ordained minister as the later ministers of the Dutch Reformed Church were. It didn't take long before the entire school up and left, ran away, hid in a cave in Hout Bay, and South African education got onto a flying start. Well, you can't really blame them. These, teenagers are troubled. Doesn't matter whether it's the 17th century or the 21st century. They have this Sturm und Drang in their lives. They're rebellious. They can't understand a word that the teacher is saying. They cannot read and write. They've got no basis of education. They don't want to be there. They've had the whole trauma of being enslaved, of being captured. So one has to see it from that perspective. Of course, the Dutch East India Company saw it a little bit differently because they said they're running away. They're trying to get out of their work contracts and whatnot and all that. So it was not easy. The Council of Policy then decided, well, we've got to have some incentives to keep them at school. And of course, the incentives that they put in place were totally not acceptable for young children. A tot of brandy every day and a couple of sticks of chewing tobacco. Well, you can imagine, totally no idea about what education was really about. But that's what it was. So there were other schools that were started by sick comforters over the next few years. You can see the areas there. And then by 1663, so we're sort of now 10 years later, Jan van Riebeeck left in 1662. Pieter van der Staal left with him because of the family relations. And the little settlement had now some houses and some buildings, and now there were a few more people, and the employees of the Dutch East India Company of the VOC were clamoring for a school for their children, because that was important to them too, and they saw the value of that. If their children wanted to belong to the church, they had to be able to read and write. The only school that existed was for slave children. And so in 1663, they established a public school. And the one thing that we read about it is that the schoolroom was in a fair-sized loft. So no purpose-built building for a school. That did not exist in South Africa until about sort of 1820s, 1830s. There were no purpose-built school buildings. So schools found places wherever they could. So a school hall like this one belonging to the Dutch Reformed Church, this would have made a marvelous school. You'd have all the children in one classroom. And so that's what happened. So they found a loft, probably in some warehouse in the town, and the children were educated there. There were 17 children in 1663, 12 white children who were employees as children. There was one Khoi child and 4 children of slaves or themselves enslaved that didn't go to the slave school in the fort. So mixed education, mixed race education happened here much earlier sometimes than we think. It was already here when the VOC was running it. And nobody thought to blink twice about it in the earliest days. The teacher at the school was Ernestus Buck, who was also a sick comforter. Unfortunately, he had a propensity for the bottle. And you can see he's carting it around with him. So teaching has always been stressful. Ask me, 44 years in education, I know. I never went to the bottle, but some of my colleagues did. So it's not unusual. You have to understand that teaching is stressful for teachers. They do whatever they can to alleviate the stress. Poor Ernestus Buck. Of course, it affected the quality of his teaching, as you can imagine. And a few years later, there was a comet that appeared in Cape Town in the skies. And the people said, aha, it's God, It's issuing a warning to Ernestus Bach, give up his bad ways otherwise. Well, of course, he didn't give up his bad ways and eventually was deported to Batavia. And the school then continued for a number of years, and it became more and more white, and the Khoi and the slave children were eventually all moved across to the slave school, but it was mixed for a little while. So that was the warning sign in 1665, and then in 1685 we see a proper segregation of the white children and the slave and the Khoi children. More the slave children, there were very few Khoi children because, you know, their communities roamed around according to the season and the grass for the cattle. So you can see here, if you were a bird flying overhead, this is where the Parliament Street entrance is, what we would say is the back, and then the Adderley Street had no entrance then because this was considered the front, which we now say is the back, and then school for boys there and two for girls. I think there were a few more girls, so they had two classrooms or two classes for girls. Of course, the slave lodge looked a bit different then. So here where it says Herengracht, that's where Adderley Street is. You can see there's no entrance there, only the entrance at the back, although I can't even see that. But that's the slave lodge. You can see the company gardens, Church Square, and the church. Interesting that those are all still there, even in different forms. The hospital is no longer there. That's the hospital that Jan van Riebeeck had to build. And this rather lovely picture comes from one of Robert Shell's books. I'm using it with permission from his wife. And of course, it's an imagined reality. We don't really know what it was like. But these children are all busy learning. They are, in all likelihood, all boys, because boys and girls were taught separately. They already had books. You can see some of them are writing on sand trays. That was very common. That was something that was done in the East, in Ceylon or Sri Lanka. It was later adopted in England by Joseph Lancaster and transported as a method of teaching to all the colonies, and was very much in evidence here at the Cape. And then you can also see, you see these little, like they look like tablets. They're not slates, they're horn books, and they had the ABC written on them, and the children could use those to copy their letters. So there was already at this stage, there were teaching materials. And remember, these are slave children, okay? And the Dutch East India Company bought those for the slave children as well as for the children of the company. The Dutch East India Company not only paid the teachers, but also paid for all the materials that were needed for education. So the investment was there. Now, we're talking about the slave children. It was made compulsory by this time when the children were taken to the slave lodge for this, at this school. It was compulsory for slave children to attend school, particularly those who were under 12. And if they were older than that, they only had religious education, usually 2 afternoons a week, because of course these children would have been working more than the younger children. Children of 12 to 16 are quite strong. They're much bigger. They could be used for work. All children at the slave lodge went to school. Every single one, because it was compulsory. So there was no slave child, unless it was particularly deaf, that could not read or write. Many of the children of the colonists or the employees of the Dutch East India Company were not as well educated as the slave children. The slave children, for a few years, received the best education at the Cape. It's a very interesting concept. Boys and girls were taught separately. The teachers that the Dutch East India Company employed were either slaves themselves or freed blacks. In other words, they'd been manumitted or given their freedom, and sometimes even convicts who were literate. And the names of these teachers fairly well documented by Robert Shell and others. The teachers all received a salary from the VOC. And to all intents and purposes, it was quite a good salary because it allowed them to manumit themselves. They could buy their freedom after a while. And then some of them went back to go and teach at the slave lodge because they were being paid a salary. And it seems to have been a reasonably attractive salary for some time. There's one very interesting teacher I want to just mention. Some of you might have heard of him, Jan Smissing. Those are the years that he lived. He probably came from Ceylon, or the coast of India in that way. He was a teacher at the slave lodge, and this little red book, it's in the archives. It's his teacher's notebook, and I've seen it, and it's beautiful. And in it he has his letters that he's teaching the children. He has lesson plans of what he's teaching the children every day. Here he's written in Dutch, and here he's got notes in Tamil, so he could read and write Tamil as well. And yeah, very well respected man. He was also freed and went back to teach for quite a while. In 1714, the school ordinance was passed, the school ordonnantie, I think it was called in Dutch. That was at the time of Governor de Chavannes. And they established now an oversight over education, because somebody has to be in charge of it. Otherwise, all kinds of nonsense can happen, like teachers getting drunk and all that sort of, children running away and, that sort of thing. So there was a group of men called the Scholarks. There were 3 of them: the deputy governor, appointed by the VOC, the captain of the garrison, and whoever was the then minister of the church. So 2 of them were VOC employees and the other one was from the church. And they were supposed to, and I say supposed to because it didn't always happen at the beginning, but they were supposed to approve of the teachers who were being appointed by the VOC to teach. So, if you took a sailor off a ship who said he could read and write and put him into the classroom, which happened, you weren't always sure what was going to be taught. And so, you had to have some kind of control over it. Today, a teacher has to have a certain approved educational qualification. That wasn't so in those days. So if you said you could read and write and you were halfway competent, they might have jumped on you with great glee and paid you because they were so short of teachers. The Scholarks were also supposed to lay out the duties of the teacher. You have to teach this, and with the age so-and-so child, you had to teach them this. That's sort of like a leerplan. But in reality, it didn't work because the Council of Policy ended up taking control of that because the 3 Scholarks either never could get together for a meeting or whatever. But it was still, although there was such minimal control, it was a very strict order of teaching of what was required. Dead boring, not only for the children who had to be taught it and had to sit there and listen, but also dead boring for the teachers. You had to follow this so rigidly, you couldn't be creative and do something or, follow topical news and make sure you taught your children something else. Now that's in the cities. In the rural area, things are slightly different. Now in the rural areas, there weren't really any towns originally, but there were settlements, there were farms, and there were sometimes little schools that were established, like you can see this little tin house that was erected is actually a school on a farm near Mossel Bay, still there. And the others are little school buildings that the farmers built for the children on their farm, their own children, and any children from the surrounding area. Mostly white children, but occasionally there were children of color there as well. And they could not get teachers to go into the rural areas of course, nothing has changed. It's still like that today in South Africa. Nobody wants to go and teach up country or, you know, in the far-flung areas. So that was always a problem. So what they used then were itinerant teachers. So they were appointed by the VOC, paid by the VOC, and they had like a little circuit or a field cornetcy that they moved around in. They went from farm to farm, and they taught there often just for a few months, and then they moved on. They're also called vagabond teachers, which is the same meaning as itinerant. And here in South Africa, in the Dutch community, they were often called meester. And you've heard that expression, meester kom. Meester gaan vir julle leer. That was that. Here there's a thing that was written, I think this was by Sir John Herschel, where he was talking about the farmers in the Tygerberg area, and about the wages, you know, one big fat sheep that was sometimes given because the salary from the VOC probably came late, if at all. And here the plea was being made, this is a miserable situation, not miserable as in the teachers were so unhappy, but miserable because they were so weak and pathetic and couldn't teach properly and not worthy of the title teacher of meester. They were useless. And can we not rather get teachers from Scotland, which they eventually did, but under the British rule? And we got some of our best teachers in the Cape Colony from Scotland because they had a very good teacher education system in Scotland. I love this picture. This is by Charles Bell of an itinerant schoolmaster. You can see him in the middle. And he's got a newspaper in front of him, a very well-known Dutch newspaper called Het Zuid-Afrikaan. You will find all those copies of that newspaper in the National Library in the gardens. And he's moving around from farm to farm, and he's reading it to the families so that they know what the news is and what's happening in the world, because they wouldn't have known. And you can see here the family sitting around the table, they're listening to him read it, the chickens are running around, it's probably the kitchen. What I love about this is here are the slaves, and look at the slave child. What's she doing? She's listening. She's listening. She's cleaning and sweeping and doing her work, but she's listening. All right? Because she also wants to know and be educated. She's not going to be allowed to be educated with the boss's white children, but she wants to. She wants to learn. So I find that a really interesting picture. I think Belle captured this very nicely. There she is. All right, and quite a well-known itinerant teacher that many South Africans will know. Anybody know? You know who this is? He's obviously a South African actor, but the character is Napoleon Blenkins in The Story of an African Farm. And there was a television series that was made some years ago, and the character of this itinerant teacher beautifully portrayed in the story. Beautifully portrayed in that he was not a good teacher, but he was a victim of his time, of the zeitgeist, you know, as it was. But yes, so that was Napoleon Blenkins. Time marched on, and in 1743, Baron van Imhoff came on a visit to the Cape, and the first thing he noticed was the deplorable state of education. And so he immediately established 2 new churches besides the one in Cape Town, and attached to those churches schools that were then also taught by the sick comforter. The one at Waveren, Tilbach, and the one at Swartland, Malmesbury. And then in 1782, now we're jumping, you see the time goes very quickly. Went much quicker in those days than it does today. The whole question of the scholars was revised and revisited, because I told you that not much happened initially because the Council of Policy just managed it themselves, but they were also governing the whole of the Cape, not colony yet, but the whole of the Cape, and they were obviously more interested in trade than education, and so they now separated those two functions, and so that put things on a better footing. The duties of the teachers were strictly laid down, something which hadn't happened earlier. Their remuneration was fixed so that you couldn't bargain and, you know, get backhanders for your services as a teacher or ask what you thought you were worth. The salary was fixed. And so the organization of education was placed on a slightly firmer footing. I wouldn't say that it was now all sorted out and wonderful, far from it, but it was moving in the right direction. There was now a bit better control. And then in 1793, a Latin school was started. Now that doesn't mean they spoke and taught in Latin. It simply means it was a classical education, which was one step higher than just a basic elementary education where children were taught to read and write and maybe given a few sums so that they could calculate when they took the master's beeste to the mark and they, you know, all that sort of thing. And I'm going to mention that Latin school again because it had a very interesting history for a little while. Anyway, let's go to these two towns. So 1743, there was a school established in Tulbagh. Louis van Dijk was the Ziekentrooster there, and the house where that school was started is still extant in Tulbagh. If you go down Church Street, there's a restaurant called Reader's. Anybody ever eaten there? Delicious food, best ice cream in the world, really nice. Reader's. Because of the reader of the church, who was also the church clerk, and that was the house of the Ziekentrooster, the sick comforter, you can just see that building here. It actually has a gable here facing the street. And the school started in that building, but they then built a little tiny school there. That you can see there is the actual little school. I find it so charming that it's still there from that time period. And then in Malmesbury, that was 2 years later, they appointed Witse Boertes there. And that was the school that was built in Malmesbury that has been demolished. It doesn't exist anymore. I think it's on the site where the Malmesbury Town Hall is now. Poor old Witse Boertes, he was also one of those teachers who couldn't take the stresses and strains of education. He had pupils that, you know, they were often too big, they were too old, they were, you know, didn't want to be in school. A father drove them there with his belt and, well, you know, and so he also, hy ook baie diep in die bottel gekyk, maar baie diep. So he was only there for a year because, you know. And then following the complaints now of what was going on, you know, one of the complaints was that there are far too many quack teachers in the schools, like people who just were not qualified to teach. Like you've heard of quack doctors, fake doctors who falsified their qualifications, treated people, took money from them, but had no qualification whatsoever. Now, we had that in education too. We still have it. Yeah. Half the Eastern Cape teachers don't have teachers qualified. Sorry, I didn't say that. But we know this happens. So now I'm going to tell you one of the biggest quack teachers we ever had at the Cape. His name was the Reverend Dr. Lawrence Haynes Halloran. Now you'd think with all those titles, gee, he must be a well-qualified man. He lived in that time period, but he was a bogus clergyman. He was not an ordained minister. He was a bigamist. He was a convicted felon, and then unfortunately he was a teacher. So he came in 1808, he made out that he was a chaplain. He was appointed by the VOC as a chaplain because he had papers. He became the headmaster of the Latin school after the first or the second one. He wasn't the first one, but he became the headmaster. He was an educated man. He could teach. He was troublesome. He just sometimes took a dislike to people, and then he wrote inflammatory letters to complain about all sorts of things addressed to the Council of Policy. He made enemies left, right, and center. Nobody liked him but he was gifted with the pen. He was tried and convicted and imprisoned and deported for all those things because he falsified his qualifications. That's a punishable offense, is today too. And the letters that he wrote were often slanderous, got him into a lot of trouble with the law. His letters of ordination from the church were all falsified. He had 3 wives, 2 nogal. I mean, as if one isn't enough, but 3. And so he was banished. He was sentenced to 7 years in New South Wales, Australia, as a convict. What?
Then can't be a bigamist. It must have been a trigamist.
Correct. Correct. And I think one of the wives was 14 years old. So he was also a child abuser, and the list just goes on and on. But what's very interesting, when he arrived in Australia, he was welcomed because he was a qualified teacher. Australia had much the same problem that we had at the Cape, not enough teachers, and he founded the Sydney Grammar School, which initially was just an ordinary little boys' school. It is today one of the biggest and most prestigious schools in Sydney. You can see the one picture here. It's still in existence, and that's the school today. That's the school as it was. So interesting, he was a felon and he was a bigamist and he was all those sort of things, but he still did something good, and in Australia they do remember him quite well, or at least in Sydney they do. Then big political changes hit the Cape. So the Cape of Storms was not only with meteorological issues, but there were political storms as well. And that kind of thing always affects education. Any political change, and education's always at the forefront of it. You know what's happened in South Africa since 1994 and before. Any political system that is imposed, education is always affected by that. So we can expect that. The French Revolution changed the world considerably, and education too, because now there's a whole new way of thinking, liberty, equality, fraternity, and suddenly that turns education on its head. It's anti-cleric, it's anti-church, and it's pro-people, and a whole new way of thinking for the people. So in 1795, the Cape was occupied by the British at the request of the Prince of Orange. And then for that period, nothing much happened in education. They all just trundled along as they did before, because nobody really knew what's going to happen now. Is this going to be forever? Or are the British going to be kicked out? Or are they going to go back? Are we going to go back to Dutch rule? Is the VOC, they didn't know. Of course, by then, as you probably know, the Dutch reform, the VOC was bankrupt and declared insolvent and ceased to exist anyway by this time. So that left education at the Cape in a bit of a leemte. Dit was onseker. Die toekoms was baie onseker. Then from 1803 to 1806 we had the Batavian Republic. Now, those ideals from the French Revolution had taken hold in Holland, which was then the Batavian Republic, and many things in education changed. And so that then spilled over to the Cape as well. And we had Advocate de Mist, who came out to the Cape, and he revised the whole education system. It's actually, if you look at what he had in mind, what he planned for the Cape, it's a pity we couldn't continue with that. I think had the Batavian period been extended and had the British not come, we would have had a much better education system. Because the British system also floundered a bit. They did not know how to apply an English education system to an African context, whereas the Dutch already had been here for 100 years. They knew the situation, and it was based very much on the principles of the French Revolution. And so in 1804, Advocate de Mist set up a school order, which was a whole plan for education. It also involved future teacher training, which he was not able to administer or to implement because, you know, they were only here for 3-4 years. But what they did do was it was the first move to make the state responsible for education. The state gradually took control of education in that period, in the Batavian period. And so we see an improvement. We see a school that some of you will have heard of called Tot Nut van het Algemeen, which is a famous Dutch school, private school, but for the Dutch settlers, that had also a profound effect on education, became the feeder school for the South African College. And so there was some very, very good education that happened in the Batavian period. And then we get to 1806, and bang, then came the British. And this time, they didn't come with a letter from the Prince of Orange saying, hello, we're just coming to babysit you for a little while. They came with guns and cannons and fought a war to take over the Cape, because by then they had realized, I think, well, mainly they were scared the French were going to come and take it, but they had also, through the years that they'd been here, and seen the benefit of what this colony had to offer in terms of wine trade and money, and also and land, and the possibility for jobs and homes and settlements and so on. So they came with meaning this time. And also with an education system, and we have to give the British credit for that. What happened in most Western countries in terms of education is education went through 3 main stages. So firstly, education was usually in the hands of the church. And then there was a system where financial aid was given by the state, usually to the church schools or any education, but often that financial aid was given to the church so that the church could implement the education. And the third and most developed step of education then was when the state took complete control of education. And that is, of course, the system that we have in most countries in the world, and we have that in South Africa today. Although we still have church schools, and we also have private schools, and we have home schools, and we have an extreme diverse system of education in South Africa. So education from 1806 roughly until 1839, and that's the date I'm actually going to stop, went through radical changes because they didn't always know what was best, and so they tried several systems. But mainly, the biggest driving factor and the biggest change was that the British government invested money into education in South Africa, and, you know, well, we're talking about the Cape of Good Hope, so that there was money available to pay for education. And that usually meant, you know, either give it to the church and let them pay their own staff, like the church clerk, to run the school. In public schools, it meant find a building, rent the building, pay the teachers, buy the books, have the schoolroom cleaned over the weekend, you know, things like that. So, and then from 1812, they tried a system where they used the church again even more, and they invented the system of the church clerk schools, die kosterskole, soos hulle in Afrikaans sê. That was Governor Craddock implemented this system, and those church clerk schools were established in the chief towns. So you will, not really in Cape Town because they had more public schools there, but there were some. You went out to Stellenbosch and Paarl and Worcester and Wellington and those areas, and you'll find all the church clerk schools there. And instruction was in Dutch, even though we now had an English system. They started out in educating in Dutch. That was all that the church clerks could speak anyway. Most of them couldn't speak or read or write English. The state paid half the salary, so say £60 of £120, that might have been the teacher's annual salary, and the other half had to be paid by the parents or the church community. So education in this period, the first part of the British occupation, was very closely associated with the Dutch Reformed Church. Also with other churches, one must say, and one must give credit to the Anglican Church, which also had many church schools on the same sort of system, and the Moravian Church, and various other mission churches, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, all of them contributed to education. They all saw education as one of their chief functions, just the way the Dutch Church did. Ultimately, the church clerk schools were not really successful because there was no control. You asked about the inspectors. Well, they didn't have a system of inspectors yet. So, if the teacher didn't feel like teaching, he just didn't go to work. So mainly there was this financial support. Private tutors and the vagabond teaching system, that continued. Sailors off the ships were still in high demand, as long as they could read and write, never mind how much they drank. We'll deal with that later. But a big change came in 1822, when Governor Somerset changed the language policy of the Cape and made English the language, the state language, the language of trade, of business, and of education. And that caused huge problems. The population didn't like it because up until now, their children, remember most of the colonists, or I don't know if you can call them colonists, say settlers, at the Cape were of Dutch descent, and their language was Dutch. So suddenly to be confronted with the English, and it was difficult. It wasn't as if they didn't want to learn English, and it wasn't as if they didn't want their children to learn English. They objected to the fact that their own language was pushed aside and only English. All right? So a system of English free schools came about, also in the major centers, and those they were established by Somerset. They were schools, as the name suggests, free. There was no contribution that the parents had to make. It was purely paid for by the state. You can imagine how sustainable that was in the long run. Of course not. But it was to try and lure the parents to send their children to the free school under the mistaken suggestion that because the teacher was paid by the state and not by the church, or appointed by the church but appointed by the state, the schools would be of good quality, which they unfortunately were not. So just one famous one was, there was one in Wynberg, which later developed into Wynberg Boys High and Primary School. And a very famous one, which takes its history right back to 1822, is Muir College in Uitenhage, Kariga, as it is today. And they celebrated their 200th anniversary 2 years ago. So the free schools, and the only reason why the Uitenhage school was so strong is because the teacher who was brought out from Scotland was James Rose Innes, who later became the SG of Education, and he was a man with a vision, and he believed in mother tongue education. And so he learned Dutch on the ship coming to South Africa from Edinburgh. He stopped off at Holland and he learned a bit of Dutch. And when he came to the Cape Colony, he absorbed himself into the community, and not pushing his own language aside, but he learned Dutch and he taught Dutch. Now, how's that? A British man is not, you can't really call him an Englishman because he's a Scot and they're quite different from the English. Much more guts and you know, sort of more free thinking. But so his school was popular because the Dutch parents had faith in the teacher, because he didn't throw the Dutch language to the dogs. And that's also why that school has survived and is doing well. Even though I've visited the school a couple of times, it's not a wealthy school any longer as it used to be, because now it's perhaps 80% black. Still has white children though. Still the same quality, still has children who are from good families, who want to be educated and want to make a contribution to South Africa, but they're poor. And so they have trouble getting in the school fees. It's not easy. It's much easier at Wynberg Boys High because they're dealing with a different clientele. But all things considered, Muir College is doing extremely well. And then 1839, and this was then the biggest change, and my story is more or less going to end here. The Department of Public Education was established by the British government, or the colonial government here at the Cape. And James Rose Innes, who was by then teaching at the South African College, he was approached and he applied for the job, and he got the job as SG, Superintendent General. And that is the point when education became a function of state here at the Cape and then in South Africa. And then things began to move in that direction. So I want to just talk a little bit about the contribution of the Dutch Reformed Church, because many of those schools, those early schools have vanished. They opened, they closed, mainly because the parental support wasn't there. If they were English free schools, most of them have disappeared because they didn't meet the needs of the community. Some of them just couldn't stay open because they were under the management of the church, and the churches in the country were not as rich as the churches in town. And so it was difficult to keep a school open. Even today, to run and manage and finance a school is phenomenally expensive. Even to build a school costs millions. Then you've got to furnish it and employ teachers and secretaries and grounds people and all sorts of, it is phenomenally expensive. So the education budget today in our country is huge. We spend an enormous amount of the gross national product on education, much more than many other countries do. Whether it's meeting the needs as it should is a debatable point, but education is expensive. And so the Dutch Reformed Church was always at the soul of local education efforts. So if you went into any town, whether it was a small town or a bigger town or a little village, if there was a church, a Dutch Reformed Church, you can be sure that the Dutch Reformed Church was involved in education in some way. The same can be said of the other churches too. They just weren't as big and as widely spread, but the Roman Catholic Church made a good contribution to education. The Anglican Church made a massive contribution, and the Wesleyan churches, and the Presbyterians, and the various missions, the Moravians, and the French, the Paris Mission Society, South African Sendinggesticht. All of them came with zeal, with love, with dedication, and where they put their hand to the desk to provide education, it happened. And particularly in the rural areas, those people would not have had any form of education, would not have been able to read and write if it hadn't been for the churches, the collective effort made by the churches. And for the Dutch Reformed Church, one has to say, it wasn't only their own schools that it supported, but it also supported undenominational public schools that the state started, and higher education and training. And there are many cases of where the Dutch Reformed Church and other churches work together. I know that at one stage in Cape Town, Dominee Forer, Abraham Forer from the Dutch Reformed Church, he went to St. George's Cathedral and took some of the sermons in Dutch, because there were English and Dutch speaking Anglicans. And that kind of samenwerking, which for a long, we didn't have that in the apartheid years, but it is coming back now. You're finding a lot of ministers in different churches working together like that, which I think is wonderful. And just to mention a few of them, so the South African College, which developed into SACS, that was an initiative of the state, but very much supported by the Dutch Reformed Church, because it was the only higher education institution in Cape Town, and so the Dutch parents sent their children to SACS. And if you look at the names of the early matriculants and the early pupils, they're Afrikaans and Jewish names, by and large. Some English-speaking ones too, very much supported by the Afrikaans or Dutch community and the Jewish community. And that was Abraham Forer who supported that. Those are the two buildings that are now part of UCT's Orange Street campus. That's the second building of SACS. And I just want to mention, by complete contrast, one that some of you may not have heard of, and that is the Batswood Dutch Reformed Church Mission School. Because this was not a school that was started by the state. It was started by the Dutch Reformed Church in Wynberg. And Wynberg had a fairly large community, but it was for their children of color, their colored community. Martha Sasal you'll find it's mentioned in all the literature. It still exists, it's still there in Wynberg. It's now part of a modern school. This is it here. It became a training school and a practicing school. And then I should just mention here, it's a young Dr. Richard van der Ross, but many of you will have heard his name. He was a leading light in colored education here at the Cape. He only passed away a few years ago. I had the great privilege of knowing him and working with him. He was the most delightful man. He and his father were both born and bred teachers. His father attended SACS, I think, and UCT, and Richard also attended UCT, but he went to the school in Constantia. Baie van julle ken die Parel Gymnasium, Dominee van der Lingen established. That was originally established to train dominees for the Dutch Reformed Church. It's today an absolutely fine and highly thought of dual medium, perhaps more Afrikaans, but it's co-educational. Dominee van der Lingen is probably spinning in his grave, but never mind. Education has to move on. The Good Hope Seminary in Cape Town, established by the Reverend Andrew Murray, who did much for education. He also established the Huguenot Ladies Seminary in Wellington. And then there's the Bloemhof Ladies Seminary in Stellenbosch, Dominee Neetling. These are all Dutch Reformed ministers, right? Big names in education. The Normal College in Cape Town, you may recognize the building. Does anybody recognize the building, particularly this one? Where's that?
Street.
Yes, it is in Buitenkant Street. It's Rust en Vreugd. So that was built as the fiscal's house, but it was used for education over the years from various different schools. But it was started as a normal college in 1878. Now, a normal college or a normal school is not the opposite of abnormal. Normal is a word that was used by the Scottish when they started their teacher training program. normal coming from the word norms, i.e. norms and standards. So when the Scottish started their education training for teachers, and you asked about teacher training, the best teacher training in the world at the time was what was happening in Scotland. And so they went according to certain norms and standards, minimum standards that teachers had to have. And they were properly trained for between 6 months to 1.5 years. It wasn't long in those days. And that was very helpful. So they decided they wanted to have a normal college here in Cape Town to train teachers. Didn't work here because the salaries of teachers were so low that although the college trained many teachers, they often went into different professions and were therefore lost to education. But there were quite a few. And again, the Reverend Andrew Murray and James Whitten was for many years the rector. When it closed, it actually closed after Dr. Whitten retired. The boys were absorbed by the South African College, which later became UCT, as you probably know, and apart from the schools. But the training part went to UCT, you know, where the School of Education, you would probably say, is the navolger. And the girls went to what was started as the Cape Town Central School for Girls, which eventually became Vredehok Primary. So the school sort of moved around and you know, gave birth to many other institutions. So John X. Merriman, who was the Prime Minister of the Cape in 1905, said the Dutch clergyman has been the very best friend of education. And that's probably the nicest thing you can say. You know, you can say many things, but this says it simply and beautifully. And I think it's right, and especially if you bear in mind that so many of these clergymen actually came from Scotland, like the Murrays. Professor Ernst Malherbe said this: no account of the history of education in South Africa will therefore be complete without some mention of the contribution made to public education by the Dutch Reformed Church. And of course the same can be said of the other churches. It wasn't only the Dutch Reformed Church, but the Dutch Reformed Church was the one with the most power, the most resources, and supported by the state. To end with, I just want to mention one thing linking to what I said right at the beginning when I told you about the 2 slave ships that came to the Cape bearing all those slaves, and the fact that they were actually children. They were of school-going age. And there were so many of them. They were the biggest group of immigrants up until the French Huguenots came. In fact, Huguenots came in 1688. So they were the biggest group of immigrants up until then. And today, we still have the same thing happening. This is a group of children taken in 2015 at Thomas Wildschut Primary School in Retreat. Now, I dare say many of you have never heard of that school. It's just a small little coloured school. But what has happened since the schools have opened up since 1994, you find that many of the coloured children have moved into the white schools. The white schools have gone into private education, and the black children and immigrant children go into the coloured schools. This is what's happening, and it's still happening like that today. And I had a chat to this principal, and he told me that probably 50 to 60% of his school is children who are from immigrant families or refugees. And look at where they're coming from. Zimbabwe, Congo, Malawi, there's one South African amongst the lot, and Tanzania, and others. And I said to him, how are these children? Is their education standard behind? He said, no. He said, they are the best students in my school, almost without fail. They are intelligent. They've got a good basic education. They are hardworking. They want to learn. They do well. They're interested in South Africa's heritage, which they adopt almost immediately without questioning it. You know, the way children do. And so these are good citizens that we're getting in again. Isn't that wonderful? And I quite like that this has gone around in a circle, because education changes like many things do. And we don't know what education is going to look like in 15, 20 years' time. It may be completely different. In the 3 years since I've been retired, there have already been many changes that I wasn't part of. And if I want to know about them, I've got to go to meetings and read up on them and that. And it will keep changing. And that's the one thing we can be certain of. Change will happen and change will come. So thank you very much for listening. Float, float, my story is out.